House on the Hill. When I first heard that name, my first reaction was, didn't we already have a horror film by that name? And it turns out, yes we did, but thankfully for everyone involved, this game shares nothing in common with that particular film. House on the Hill is a first-person horror game developed by Steppe Hare Studio, a studio with, shall we say, a fairly diverse portfolio of past titles. The quality of said titles tends to be a little on the underwhelming side, but for the most part, they each are pretty self-aware and usually have one or more interesting game mechanics supporting them. While House on the Hill isn't the studio's first foray into horror, it is easily the most competent one thus far, by a long stretch. You start the game as a somewhat inexperienced thief being guided by your partner, who's giving you instructions via an earpiece, as you make your way into this foreboding mansion. The first thing you'll notice is that the game looks really good, and on a technical level the performance is really consistently smooth. Throughout the entire recording process, my frames stayed consistently at around 60 FPS. I tried to lock the frame rate with VSync or another similar frame rate lock tool, something I don't normally do when playing recreationally, but simply do for these videos. But even with VSync enabled, a sudden CPU or GPU demand spike can momentarily drive down your FPS, so credit to the development team here for ensuring the game's stability. Once you complete the tutorial, you can proceed to go to the actual mansion you intend to break into and rob. Your goal once there is to acquire a rather valuable diamond hidden in a security vault somewhere in the personal office of the man who lives there. But, as ever is the case with pretty much any horror game, things go wrong fairly quickly, and you quickly realize that not everything is as it seems. I won't go heavily into story spoilers because I think due to the nature of it being a story-driven horror game, the game is best experienced by yourself. That said, this being a review, I will at some point end up touching on certain game mechanics and game features not seen at the start, so consider everything from this point onwards spoiler light, albeit not spoiler free. While the horror themes rise very much to the surface of this game, there are a fair amount of interactive puzzle mechanics that inject a fair amount of flavor into the experience. This is not Outlast 2, where all you do is pretty much run and hide. Not that I really minded, because I still view Outlast 2 as one of the most intense and adrenaline-pumping horror games of the past generation, and I'm not budging from that stance, no matter what the aggregate review scores indicate. That said, House on the Hill takes an almost completely contrasting approach on how to do horror. For the most part, it is very slow-paced, to the point that it's almost to the game's detriment at times. There's this one chase sequence, fairly early into the game, maybe about 15 minutes or so in, when you're being chased by this ugly-ass guy who looks like a cross between Granny and a Borderlands bandit. I'll try to put it on the screen now. When you're being chased down this seemingly endless corridor of twists and turns until you finally get to this door, which you're supposed to bolt shut to stop the person chasing you from following you inside. Of course, this being a horror game, this attempt goes about as well as could be expected, and things continue to escalate from there. But what I want to draw your attention to is that during this chase sequence, your character cannot seemingly run. At most, they seem to be doing a kind of moderately fast walk. I move faster than that when I'm looking for the TV remote, wherever I put it. Another weird thing I noticed is that when I first closed the door, I had a lead of several seconds on my pursuer. When I briefly opened the door in a mistaken attempt to click on the bolt on the back of the door in order to lock and secure it properly, and in doing so accidentally opening the door for a fraction of a second, no longer, the enemy chasing me had somehow mysteriously teleported into existence on the other side of the door. There was simply no way he should have been able to be there.
Close the door! The bolt's on the door!
And even the character itself seemed confused, as if the game was still loading him in for some inexplicable reason. The controls in this game are very weird. What the game doesn't tell you is that almost everything in the game is controlled via the mouse. It's kind of a given in most modern games nowadays that you stick to the standardized control layout. Mouse movements indicate your line of sight, you move your character using WASD, hit F to equip your flashlight if you have one, E for interacting with objects, Shift to run, and Control for crouching. Generally speaking, if you're going to change up this popular formula, at least make that clear to people early on into the game. To the best of my recollection, I've never played any horror game which relegates so many input commands to the left mouse button. I generally play PC controls. I like each keyboard key or mouse button to do its own thing. This isn't a console where there is an understandable necessity behind adding multiple purposes to each button, since on a controller you are far more limited than on a PC keyboard. And I know the counter argument to this, but you can just look at the controls menu, and the truth is twofold. Number 1, very few people look at the controls menu, and I would even go so far as to say that the majority of average casual gamers don't really even know that most games have a control menu in the first place. Number 2, and I've said this before in other videos, but I'll say it again, if you as a developer choose not to include relevant critical information in the actual game, but try to hide it away in a place that people wouldn't normally look, then the blame falls on you as the developer. Don't pull the rug out from underneath someone's feet and then blame them for falling. Reaction time is critical in certain games, and in a horror game with a fair number of chase sequences, you don't want to have the player be confused about what button to hit at what particular moment, in which specific set of circumstances. For the most part, the actual gameplay of the game is pretty straightforward, with the entire core gameplay experience being very much of a guided, strictly linear experience. Well, linear at least in the sense of how the game navigates the player through the world in the game. Invisible walls are very much a thing here. Go only where the game tells you to go, at the time the game tells you to do, and nowhere else at no particular time. Everything in this world is placed very deliberately. Every room you go into, you're either there for a narrative purpose or for an atmospheric purpose. Sometimes these two themes collide, and you get rooms dedicated to both. Atmospheric storytelling, for those unfamiliar with the term, is a concept generally found in visual media, such as movies, TV shows, or games, where the goal is to, only by using indirect, implicit measures, infer some narrative detail that pushes the story forward. If you've ever heard the phrase, "a picture is worth 1,000 words," then you can only imagine how much narrative material you can convey in a single film scene or in-game location. Just look at how many channels here on YouTube dedicate themselves to discussing or explaining the lore of one or more particular games. The storytelling here in House on the Hill is a sort of hybrid blend between traditional linear storytelling and atmospheric storytelling, similar to games like Layers of Fear. However, if you play House on the Hill yourself, you'll notice that this is but scratching the surface as far as comparisons to Layers of Fear go. There is oh so much more these two games share in common. But that's not the conversation I want to have today, so I digress. Now, one gameplay mechanic that I'm sure will either prove compelling or divisive depending on your point of view is the game's time loop mechanic. House on the Hill as a game only takes about 20 minutes to beat. Yep, I said it. And to quote Star Wars, it's true from a certain point of view. However, the trick is you have to beat it 4 times in a row to actually complete the game. Every time you complete what you set out to do, the game literally rewinds itself and forces you to replay it again. Except this time, things will be a little bit different. The house, initially seeming kind of small and enclosed, despite its excessive exterior size, actually is quite large, except that each playthrough restricts you to different specific areas of the house. In this way, I am quite reminded of Resident Evil 7 and how closed off the baker's residence was at first, and then eventually how large it ended up being the further you got into the story. Except again, the distinction here is that the house doesn't get any bigger, as for the most part you don't retread the same areas, but rather stick to whatever new linear path the game has you following. It does feel a little bit weird to think that the entire game can be beaten in the span of less than 2 hours, really about an hour and a half when you think about it. Even when the eventual 5th alternate timeline gets added, thereby adding a new branch of gameplay, I do think we're looking at about a 2-hour-long experience, maybe a little more or less. Horror games do tend to be on the shorter side compared with most other game genres, but even by the lowered length standards for horror games, House on the Hill tends to be a little bit on the slim side. I'm torn because on one hand it's very clear to me that the game will likely add only the 5th story branch and nothing more, because they feel that completes the story, but I think there's far more they could tap into, whether as an update to the game itself or as some kind of paid expansion. The game doesn't really need more content per se, it's functional as is, but I do think there are many areas where the core concepts in regards to both the story and the gameplay mechanics could be fleshed out further to make the experience really shine. One thing related to this that caught my attention is that while the game is in Steam Early Access, it's estimated to remain in Early Access for a remarkably short time window, barely a month, before it ultimately releases in full on the Steam store as a finished game. With that in mind, I find it highly unlikely we're going to get any kind of major story updates beyond what's already been promised, aka that much alluded to 5th act, but I can still hold out hope for either a DLC expansion or hopefully a sequel if the game does really well. Currently, it seems to only be reaching a rather small demographic with roughly 150 public user reviews on Steam as of the time of this recording, but you never know. Here's hoping anyway. Now, regarding one of the most important bits of any horror-based running simulator, the enemy design. Because how scary something is when it's chasing you with the intent to do horrible things to your dead body is an excellent motivator for running away from them. The enemy design here is okay. I would by no means call it good. By any horror standards, it's passable and nothing more. I don't know if the developers depleted their budget on the visual quality of the house or something, but I honestly hope they rework some of the enemy models to look far scarier. The benefit of this being an early access game, such reworks aren't exactly out of the realm of possibility, meaning it could actually happen, and I do hope it happens. Now, regarding the game's price, as anyone who's followed me here on YouTube for any length of time can attest, I am infamously fickle when it comes to the cost-value proposition. In other words, how high the game's price is in relation to how much value it offers to the player. Many factors can be applied here, and generally depends on what the genre this game falls into. As a horror game, how good is the immersion factor? How good are the models and animations? How scary is it? Etc. When I first got offered a review key for the game, I figured this game would go for the usual $14.99 to $19.99 price tag like any other similar horror games have gone for. But I was mistaken. The actual retail price of this game listed on Steam is $6.99 USD, or your regional equivalent. A really low price if you think about it, which surprised me, and as far as I'm concerned, I actually think it's too low. For the amount of content and the relative quality of said content, and the eventual inclusion of more content as promised by the developer, I'm surprised it's not at least $9.99. I enjoyed what I played. Yes, I have some minor qualms and nitpicks, but that doesn't stop me from viewing the game as a honestly worthwhile and enjoyable affair. Overall, The House on the Hill is not perfect, not that I really expect any game to possibly be, because that's an impossible standard. Its story is a bit cliche, albeit with some clever twists along the way. The gameplay is enjoyably solid, but nothing that I would call revolutionary or entirely original. It fulfills nearly all the basic expectations one would have of any small-scale single-player horror game, but it only excels in a few areas. There is a lot of competition in the horror genre, and so many different approaches regarding how to effectively scare while also simultaneously intrigue the player. It's really up to you to decide for yourself if this game looks scary and fun enough for you to play personally. Some people need their horror games to be fast, think on your feet type experiences, while others prefer the slower, more methodical, suspense-building games. This game definitely fits the latter description. For me, it checks enough boxes to be counted as a worthwhile bit of fun, and I look forward to revisiting it again when it exits early access as a full, complete experience. On that note, though, I think I'm going to wrap it up for today. It's been a little while since I've reviewed a horror game, mainly because most horror games put up on Steam look like garbage, haphazardly thrown together in less than a week using a bunch of placeholder Unity engine assets bought on the Unity marketplace. Either that, or you have some games like Resident Evil 3, which seems more interested in being an elaborate puzzle solver game rather than an actual horror experience. But I digress. On a final note, lest I forget, here's the selected comment of the week from R. Parker, who asks in response to my recent video on Hellpoint, has this been patched yet? Sadly no, Parker, it has not been. That said, even at the worst of times, it still has less performance issues than Marvel's Avengers game, which performance-wise is about as disappointing as Bill Cosby's personal life choices. With that said, if you want to support the work I do on this channel, there's a number of ways you can do so without costing you a penny, because I don't ask people for that. If you want to support me, I'm going to tell you the ways you can do it right now. Be sure to click the like button and let me know what you think of this game or my review down in the comments down below. I respond to nearly every single comment posted on my channel. The benefit of not having a whole lot, I can respond to the ones I see. So if you're looking to get my attention, definitely leaving a comment is easily your best means of doing so. Sharing the video also really helps too if that's what you want to do. If you want to see more videos like this one in the future, be sure to subscribe and click the bell to get notified when a new video goes live. I try to post on a somewhat weekly basis, usually every 7 to 10 days, depending on my schedule and what games are available to review. Thanks as always for your support, especially thank you to those of you who are subscribed and who have been following me and have been making this whole channel of mine possible. I definitely appreciate it now more than ever. This is WarriorDan signing out. Stay awesome everybody, stay safe, and peace out.